everyone, welcome back to my channel, and welcome to day 20 of Bookmas. Today is my top 24 books from 2024. So I did not pick all of my 5-star reads for this. I went through basically anything that I rated in the 4-star range and just picked out books that like really stood out to me. I mainly picked romance and fantasy, which were my two largest genres this year. Mainly because thrillers rarely or ever rated that highly. I did read a lot of thrillers this year, but they're never really rated above a 3.75. Some of them are 4-star. For the most part, fantasy and romance are the ones that stick with me the most. So those are the ones I picked, and we're gonna go through them. Probably not take too long with them just because we'll be here all day. But I am gonna go through them, talk a little bit about each of them, and this is in no particular order at all either. I am going to start with the books that I don't physically own just so that I don't forget to talk about them, but for the most part I do own all of these books. The first one we're going to talk about is Quicksilver by Callie Hart. I just read this book end of November and I freaking loved it. I'm very upset that I don't own it. I hate the cover. I mean, no hate on anyone that made that cover art. I don't like stuff like that on a cover. So I did order the special edition that's coming out in like August. No idea what it's going to look like, hoping it looks different, but there is a special edition coming out in August. So I did pre-order that. But I loved this book. Like, Kingfisher is literally like the perfect man. Like, he's the perfect mix of like caring but also super sarcastic that I just love. So when we had Saris was from like a different part of the world. There's these portals that you can travel through with Quicksilver, and she accidentally activates one, and then Kingfisher ends up coming through, and then their storylines end up being intertwined, and she is more powerful and has more of a sway on things in the world and the portals and all of that than she knew. So that's pretty much all I can really say about that, but it is just a fantasy romance. There is like a war going on. There's kings and queens in both like the Fae realm and the human realm, and there's good and evil obviously in both too, and it's figuring out how those are entwined and like what Saris as well as what Kingfisher's role is in all of this. But it was such a good romance. I went into this book skeptical because I had heard like either love it or you don't, and it was so hyped, and I get really worried about hyped books, but I thoroughly enjoyed this book, and I highly recommend it if you liked like an ACOTAR type book. If you just enjoy like that fairy romance kind of stuff, I think that you will like this one as well. But again, not everybody's gonna like every book. Two Abby Jimenez books I'll talk about together. They are in the same little trilogy interconnected standalone thing, and that is Yours Truly and Just for the Summer. Yours Truly follows Brianna and Jacob, and they are both doctors and they work together, and I love Abby Jimenez's books because they represent like different types of like mental illness or just like neurodivergent things that I don't think is represented enough in books, and she does it in such a way that's relatable to someone that struggled with a lot of the things that were talked about in this series, especially this book. I felt like Brianna and Jacob together were me, just the two different things they were struggling with. I felt like I related to both of them. But basically he comes to work at her hospital, and they're kind of fighting for the head position as, I think in the emergency room, like the head doctor position in the emergency room, and she'd been there for forever, but they don't then, bring in this guy, and then all of a sudden now she's fighting for this position for when this other person retires, and at first they don't get along because of that, and then slowly they start to spend more time together and open up to each other, and they both have things going on in their lives that are obviously affecting them, and they kind of work through that together, and they just build this really beautiful relationship, and I loved that book. But then Just for the Summer, which was the third book, Just for the Summer was the third book in that series, and that follows Justin and Emma, and they basically, I don't want to say fake date, they start dating each other because of a Reddit thread where Justin like said, every time I date somebody, they break up with me and then end up finding they're like happily ever after every time. And she's, I guess, in the same position. Like, every time she dates a guy, they break up and he goes and finds his future wife. So they were like, well, if we date each other and then break up, then we'll each find our happily ever after. Maybe we'll break the curse. But obviously that doesn't happen because it's a romance novel and we all know what's going to happen. But she ends up coming to this town. She's a traveling nurse, and she ends up going to that town for the summer, just for the summer, to fake date him or date him so that they can break this curse, and ends up falling in love with like the town and her job and him and all of this stuff, and like he's got a lot going on in his life with his family and things that he's dealing with. He's basically a 20-some-year-old that has to raise his entire family, and he's obviously struggling with that, and he doesn't have a lot of time for a real relationship and everything, which can affect him outside of what they're trying to do. And she's struggling with her family issues and everything, and there's just a lot going on. Her best friend in this, I cannot remember her name, but I freaking loved her because she was me. She was me. She just said what she wanted and she didn't care, and I loved that. So again, a really good feel-good romance, but also Abby Jimenez's books do make you feel a lot of feelings. So don't go into it thinking it's gonna be, you know, something super lighthearted and cutesy, because there are way deeper things that are discussed in her books. Book number 4 is Emily Henry's Funny Story. This is probably my favorite Emily Henry book. I did read all of her romance novels this year, and this follows Daphne and Miles, and at the beginning of the book, Daphne's fiance breaks up with her to start dating his childhood friend and actually marry his childhood friend. So she ends up moving in with Miles, who was that childhood friend's boyfriend at the time. So it's like they kind of swapped couples in a really weird way. But Miles and Daphne move in together just because she has nowhere else to go because her ex, Peter, kicked her out of the house. And then they end up just kind of developing this like weird friendship coping thing, and things grow out of that. But it's just a really cute story, because at first they're like, let's fake date to make them jealous because we'll bring each other to their wedding, because of course, you know, to rub salt in the wound, they get invited to the wedding. And things obviously develop from there, and Daphne's trying to decide if she really wants to even stay in that city because she moved there for Peter, but now that they're not together, she doesn't know that that's where she wants to stay. So it's like kind of her finding herself and figuring out what she really wants to do, because she's always made choices in her life based on what other people want rather than what she wants. So Miles kind of helps her figure that out, and it's just a beautiful story, and it's honestly my favorite book by her, and probably one of my favorites. I'm not doing these in any specific ranking, but I really did love that book, and it's probably up there in maybe the top 5 that I read this year. Okay, so I do own the rest of them. So we're gonna go, let's stick with romance, because that's what I was talking about. We'll stick with that, and then we'll go into fantasy, and then the 2 like random genre ones I have. So the first one here is book number 5 is The Score by Elle Kennedy, and this is Dean and Allie's story from the Off-Campus series. This is book 3, and this was my favorite. It's kind of a reformed rake kind of situation, and I love that if it's done well. And it's a very physical relationship. It starts off that way, but then they develop feelings, and I love watching a guy that's been like, I'm only ever gonna hook up with girls, I don't need a girl, completely falling head over heels for a girl and wanting nothing but to help her and to like be with her and all of that. And that's what this book was. I loved Dean. I know a lot of people's favorite book is The Deal, which is a close second, but there was just something about this story that spoke to me, and I adored it. So there's a lot more to Dean than meets the eye, and I think that's why I liked his character so much. So this was book number 5. Another hockey romance. Book 6 is Daydream by Hannah Grace. This is the 3rd book in the Maple Hills series, and my favorite book in that series so far. And this follows Hallie and Henry, and Henry has kind of stepped up into the role of hockey captain, and he's trying to juggle all of that. And Hallie works at the library, and she's like a tutor, and she's trying to help him with some of his classes and getting through his work and everything, and they develop a friendship through that. And she's just this very sweet, innocent girl, and Henry's like a sweet guy as well, and they just develop this adorably like beautiful friendship. I don't know how else to describe it, and then it eventually grows into something more. And Hallie is just so relatable in so many ways to me. And obviously she's a huge Taylor Swift fan because she is wearing the cardigan there from Folklore. And there's a lot of like cute little Taylor Swift moments that were really relatable, obviously, to someone. I'm a self-proclaimed Swiftie, but in general, just like the things that she did and the ways that she coped with things and her thoughts and everything were just really relatable as well. And this was a beautiful like friends to lovers romance done in a very tasteful, fun way. And I think they both dealt with a lot of deeper things as well along the way, but it wasn't in a way that made the book super, super sad. And they dealt with things kind of like adults. So loved this one as well. Book 7 is Allie Hazelwood's Bride. I loved this book way more than I thought I was going to. This obviously deals in the Omegaverse. It's a vampire and a werewolf put into a marriage of convenience, and they both have their reasons for wanting that marriage, and more comes out during it, and obviously feelings develop, and more comes out about what's going on in the world of like the humans and the vampires and the werewolves, because they do exist in the real world. It is like an urban fantasy, but there's like alliances being made with the humans on both sides as well as the werewolves. And I don't know if there's any other, I can't remember if there were any other like species, but Lo and Misery were just amazing. And then Lo has this little sister that is part of the book as well, that she was just freaking adorable. I loved her. And it was just a really fun, unexpected read from Allie Hazelwood, I think. I didn't know that I would love this as much as I did. It probably was my favorite one I read from her this year, up there with Check and Mate. I did really enjoy Check and Mate as well. But I really, really enjoyed this, and it makes me want to dive back into like Omegaverse stuff, just because I also listened to The Fake Mate this year on audiobook and I really enjoyed that. So pleasantly surprised, hoping there's a follow-up, because there was like a second relationship that was kind of hinted at the end of this. So I don't know if that'll spur into like another standalone, interconnected standalone, because a lot of her like feminist novels are interconnected standalones because they talk about the different characters in that world in the different books. So it's possible. Next we have The Right Move by Liz Tom Ford. This is the second book in the Windy City series and the perfect book boyfriend. No one has ever beat him. No one will ever beat Ryan Shea. This follows Indy and Ryan, and Indy is a flight attendant we meet in the first book for the hockey team in Chicago, who is best friends with Stevie, who is Ryan's sister. She falls into a situation at the beginning where she has nowhere to go, nowhere to live, because she has a really messy breakup with her boyfriend. And Stevie's like, oh, you can live with Ryan because he has a lot of space, and like neither of you are ever home because you're traveling with the team, so it won't be like you're in each other's way at all. And they had a really funny meeting in the first book when this all happened that kind of like scared the shit out of Ryan when it came to Indy, and colored their relationship from there, and she thinks like he hates her and all of that because of that situation. But it's just really adorable. Both of these characters are like the sweetest human beings ever, and Ryan Shea is just like what every girl should aspire to wanting in a man. And not just because of like anything in particular, but it's just the thoughtfulness and like the how much he cares and the little things he does. Like this is a perfect example of like small acts of kindness, and like if he wants to, he will. And she just wrote a perfect man in this book. So it has nothing to do with obviously like, who makes a ton of money. No, it was every little thing that he did in here to show her that he cared, even when he didn't know what that meant. That was just beautiful. So highly recommend this whole series, highly recommend. But I tried to only pick one book from it because I could have talked about all of them. A recent read for me is All Roads Lead Here by Mariana Zapata. This is a slow burn, and I know that people talk about all of her books are slow burns, but holy crap, I didn't think it was going to be as slow of a slow burn as it ended up being. But it was done so well and so enjoyable, and the story, again, just well put together, and the whole like single dad-esque part of the trope was done well, and the grumpy sunshine thing was done well, and the like finding herself and standing up for herself and learning how to be her own person and standing on her own 2 feet. We follow Aurora and Tobias Rhodes, they just call him Rhodes, and she moves to this small Colorado town that she grew up in because she has a very bad breakup as well, and she moves into like his spare apartment, kind of without him knowing, but without him knowing she was coming. His son kind of did that to make money. But anyway, she shows up there and he like wants to kick her out, but he gives her a chance. He's like, you can stay here for this long and then you need to find somewhere else to live just so that you can like get on your feet and whatever. And obviously things change, and he begins to like really see her for who she is, because I guess there were like things that put him off at the beginning about her, because he's a very closed off person. He didn't want to trust her. He didn't want to believe that she was like a good person, and he didn't want to open himself up to anybody. But you know, the grumpy men always do that. So again, well written. This was one of those books that I've been talking about if you've been watching my videos, that's like the characters deal with their feelings and their problems in a more mature adult way, and there's not that like terribly dramatic third act breakup, but there is something that happens, but it's dealt with in a mature manner. And I'm starting to like those kinds of romances better. The drama's good every once in a while. I pick books intentionally for drama, we'll get to a few of those, but every once in a while I want to pick up a romance, and I just want people to be able to communicate and talk, and that's how this book was. And it was very low spice, even though it was a slow burn and it eventually got there. The spice was like very minimal, so that's also a really good thing if you don't love a lot of spice in books. I've only read one of her books, but so far that seems to be how she writes. I will be reading more of hers next year. I have my list ready to go, and I'm hoping I enjoy a few more of her books as much as I enjoyed this one. Another favorite from a series I read was Reckless by Elsie Silver. This follows Winter and Theo again, one of those perfect book boyfriends. This is an accidental pregnancy trope. I don't think that's really a shock because I think it's on here. It's on the back, but I don't love that trope, but it was done so well. Elsie Silver has a tendency to make me like tropes that I don't like single dad and surprise pregnancy. But Theo is just such a sweetheart, and like he thaws winter. So like he's the sunshine, she's the grumpy, and she's just misunderstood, and she's been trying to like, again, close herself off, and she's starting to open up more and more to the people around her. And because of things that happen in her life, she ends up trying to get closer to Summer, who is our love interest in the first book, who's her sister, and that brings her to this town and brings her more into Theo's life. And then obviously that situation happens, and from there it builds the story. I'm not going to go into too much more detail, but a very well written story for a trope that I don't particularly like. So highly recommend this whole series. The whole Chestnut Springs series is just a fun, good time. I probably will reread these at some point because I just had a good time and they were quick, easy reads. But this one and Heartless were definitely the ones that spoke to me the most, which is a single dad trope. So like I said, Miss Elsie Silver. The next two books I'm going to talk about together because they're from the same universe. I couldn't pick just one. I probably could pick a favorite out of these two, but I wanted to talk about both of them, and that was Daisy Hates the Great Undoing and Magnolia Parts Into the Dark. I prefer Daisy Hates books, and this is the most recent one, and I loved this book, but this book was the first one that made me actually care about BJ and Magnolia. I did not like their first two books, but those two books made this one worth it. Still prefer the storylines in this one though, and the characters in these ones. So we have this universe that follows basically like BJ and Magnolia in the Magnolia Park books, and then Julian, Christian, and Daisy. Daisy and Julian are the Hates siblings, and then Christian is the love interest for Daisy. And they are intertwined. They're the same friend groups, somewhat. And it's just like elite London society, kind of, also like mafia kind of situation in this side, and drama. So it's Gossip Girl in London. I know that's what a lot of people say, but that's truly what it is. I mean, a lot of the characters in here very closely mirror some of the characters in Gossip Girl, but really enjoyed this series this year, the parts that I read of it this year. Again, finally got to a book where I cared about Magnolia and BJ. Didn't really ever care about them before then, but did love this. It was very sad, very relatable book. And I did say this in the vlog where I read this book. Magnolia deals with death a lot in this one, and the thoughts that come from having someone close to you die. And the way that she thinks about death, and the way that Jessa Hastings wrote how Magnolia thinks about death and talks about death, was so relatable to me as someone who probably thinks about that a lot more than they should. And in the ways that I think about it, I shouldn't be thinking about that kind of stuff. But it was very relatable to see that like Jessa wrote this, so obviously I'm not the only person in the world that thinks that way. So that was very like comforting and therapeutic, but also difficult to read at times. So that's probably why I related to this one so much. But the story in this one was just great, and I cannot wait for the next Daisy Hates book. I think there's going to be 2 more from what I've heard. Don't know when they're coming though. Also, we'll talk about the next 2 books together as well, and that was Keeping 13 and Redeeming 6, books 2 and 4 from the Voice of Tommen series by Chloe Walsh. This is the second book in Shannon and Johnny's point of view, and it's kind of when their story really takes off and you learn more about both of them and things begin to get resolved. And then this is the second book in Joey and Aoife's point of view. And this takes it further. The first book, Saving 6, and then the beginning of this book take place over the same timeline as Biding and Keeping 13. But then this book goes further past that. At some point, it's huge. Their story was more... Their story, like, meant more to me, and I connected to their story more. Not that I've had any of that happen to me, but, like, their characters I just cared about more than Shannon and Johnny. But still enjoyed both sides of it. I just, like, felt so much for Joey in these books. Like, he was just, he was so broken, and I just wanted him to, like, I wanted someone to shake him and be like, you don't have to be like this, and you don't have to think you need to be like this, and that nobody loves you. And it was just very difficult books to get through, but I just loved this whole series. I did read Taming 7. I am caught up on this, and I'm wondering if she's going to do any more, because I also heard the other day from a friend that she's kind of sick of writing this series, so I don't know what's going to happen from this, but we'll see. So far, the books have been really good, and they are books I would see myself rereading and maybe annotating, just because there's a lot of stuff that happens in them that was just really beautifully written. But we shall see. Redeeming 6 is probably one of my top 2 books. That is probably my #1 romance book that I read this year. Not probably. It is my #1 romance book that I read this year. And then my #1 fantasy book we'll talk about too. But let's actually first talk about the 2 books that are kind of their own different genres. And the first is Stephen King's Holly. This follows Holly Gibney, and she gets called to this town. She works for Finders Keepers, which is like a detective agency she started with Bill Hodges in the Bill Hodges trilogy. And she's still working there, and she gets called to this town because there's all these missing girls, and she ends up meeting this like weird couple that's professors at the local university, and there's more than meets the eye to them. And it's kind of disturbing, but it's a Stephen King book, what can you expect? But I think I love this one so much because I love Holly's character, and I love every book that he's written that she's been part of that I've read. I think there's actually one that I didn't know she was in that I still have to read, and I can't remember what book it is. And then his next book, I also believe, will have her as a character. So he's holding on to her. He loves her, and he's not letting go. So I'm okay with that. I love her as a character. Her stories are always so fun, and she is just so unique and quirky, and just, I love her character. I don't know how to describe it without, if you didn't read any book with her in it, where you just kind of deal with her and her mindset and the way she talks and stuff. Like, I don't know, she's just really sweet, but also like a very strong female character in her own way. And I really enjoyed this one. I don't know if you might want to read some trigger warnings before that, because there's one thing that happened in that usually really bothers me, and I didn't see it coming. So that was kind of not fun. Then, I don't know exactly what to call this. It's kind of like some type of fiction with magical realism. It's just, I don't know what kind of fiction this is considered, but it's just fiction. And this is The Wishing Game by Meg Schaefer. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. It is basically Willy Wonka for book lovers. This girl is trying to adopt this little boy, and she just doesn't have the money to do it. She's a teacher's aide. She doesn't have a job that she can afford to do that, and it's not like a steady income, so she's obviously running into a lot of issues with trying to adopt him. So she ends up being invited into this competition to win the final book in this series by her favorite author, and it's a series that they've read together, her and this boy. And he never released the book, so he's going to give the manuscript to one of the 5 people that have been invited to this island because they were like big fans of his, and they could do whatever they want with it. They can sell it, they can read it by them, they can keep it to themselves, whatever, but she planned on obviously selling it to be able to make the money to adopt the little boy. But what comes out of the story is so much more than that, and it's just, it was so well written and such a surprise read that I highly recommend this to anybody. And it is like under 300 pages. It's like just over 260 pages, I think. 280. So, very quick read, very short book, but such a beautiful story. And if you love books, I think you'll really love this book. Like, if you love people that love books, like if you like reading about that, I think you'll love this book. Obviously, if you're here, you like books. I would hope. Alright, on to fantasy. This is the last little genre we're gonna do. The first one is A Monsoon Rising by Thea Guanzon. This actually knocked another book off of the list because I just finished this book today, and right before I filmed this, and I completely was like, this needs to be on this list. This is the second book in the Hurricane Wars series, and the relationships in this one just like were so elevated from the first one. The storyline is so strongly Kylo Ren and Rey coded now, and I'm loving it, and I'm loving where the story is going, and it ended on such a cliffhanger that now I can't wait for the third book, and I don't know when we're getting it. But basically you have Taliesin and Alaric, and they basically have Taliesin and Alaric, and they are on opposite sides of this like war. Like, he's part of the Empire because he's the Knight Emperor, and she's part of the Resistance essentially. But then they find that their powers actually need to work together because their powers are more connected than they thought to be able to like save the world, but they're still on opposite sides of this overarching war that's going on. So there is like true enemies to lovers in here. There's feelings that they both know they shouldn't be having, but they are having, and it's just, it was so well written. I freaking love this book, and I'm so excited for the third one. If you are a Star Wars fan, I think you will love this. If you're not, I don't know, because it is very heavily Star Wars coded, but I love Kylo Ren with every part of myself, so that is why I think I love that so much. Another fantasy is Our Violin Ends, which is the second book in the These Violent Delights duet by Chloe Gong, which is a Romeo and Juliet reimagining, retelling kind of thing in 1920s Shanghai that has a little bit of fantasy elements to it because there is magic in this world, but it is like 2 rival gangs, and you have Roma and you have Juliet, and the story's pretty similar, obviously, to Romeo and Juliet. They have their friends and then their families that don't want them to be together, but then they figure out they actually need to work together in order to help the city because there's this like evil spirit. There's this like evil magic that's trying to take over the city and everything, and they don't know who to trust. They don't know who's actually good and who's bad on either end of the spectrum here. So they think they need to work together, but then they both along the way are like betraying each other, all that kind of stuff. But beautifully written story. Definitely am mad at myself for putting these off as long as I did because I was so afraid to read them and I don't know why, but I thoroughly enjoyed both books, but this one a little bit more than the first one. Next we have Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherland. This is the second book in the Emily Wilde series by Heather Fawcett, and this is definitely more, it's still a more cozy fantasy, but this was a little bit higher stakes than the first one because you're following more of like Bumblebee's storyline and they're helping him because he's in a situation where he needs them to go on an adventure to help him. But she's still like, it's still obviously dealing heavily with fairies and her writing her encyclopedia and finding this information out about fairies. But I just love these books. They're such like fun, quick, cozy, beautifully atmospheric books. So if you haven't picked these up yet and you like a little fun, cozy fantasy that's more romance, the romance also picked up in this one too. Highly recommend. Oh, we're getting there. We have five more books to talk about. Next is a Leigh Bardugo book, Hellbent, the second book in the Alex Stern series, and this is like a dark academia fantasy following Alex Stern, who is part of Ninth House, which is an organization that helps the elite societies at Yale do these like ceremonies and stuff where they're communing with the dead, and she has to help keep those safe and keep the like bad spirits away to like not harm anybody and make sure that everything, you know, goes according to plan. And it deals a lot with like the other realms and everything. And in the first book something happens with Darlington, who's like her mentor, and then this book deals heavily with that storyline. The first book's a lot of world building and a lot of understanding what's going on. This book dealt with Darlington's storyline a lot more, and I really enjoyed this one. It was definitely faster paced than Ninth House, and it almost felt like a completely different type of a book than Ninth House. It obviously takes place in the same world, but because there was less world building, this was more adventure and action than the first book, I think. So love this series, can't wait for the third one. Another Leigh Bardugo book, Crooked Kingdom, which is the second book in the Six of Crows duology, which is the middle part of the Grishaverse. I read the whole Grishaverse this year, so I felt like I needed to pick my favorite book from that, and it was definitely Crooked Kingdom. Six of Crows deals with these like six friends who go, I don't want to call them friends, these six like characters who all go on a heist together. They all go to try to save this person, and then something happens at the end of that book that leads into this storyline, which is like consequences of stuff that happened with that heist and dealing with different parts of the world and like bad people and like this bad, there's this drug that is being like peddled for Grisha, but it's not good for Grishas. It's being used to like control them and make them not themselves and everything, and that's what these books deal heavily with. There's these two, as well as a little bit of King of Scars and Rule of Wolves, but it's really heavy in these two. And that's what they're trying to figure out, like who's making it, who's selling it, what the end game totally is. And it brings them into like this underground world and like this battle they didn't really even know was going on. So really, really enjoyed this. Loved the characters in this book. Loved that it followed so many different point of views because it definitely made the books go faster. But highly recommend that. You can read that duology without reading Shadow and Bone. Then I had to pick my favorite Cassandra Clare book that I read this year, and this was the third book in my favorite little series in the Shadowhunters universe, and this is Queen of Air and Darkness, which is the third book in the Dark Artifices series. This follows a group of Shadowhunters from the LA Institute in more modern time. Like, I think the 2017 time frame. Were there dates in here? I feel like there were at some point dates in here, but... And they're fighting again. This has to do a lot. This trilogy dealt a lot with the Fae and things that happened at the end of the Mortal Instruments series. And this is a few years later, them dealing with the consequences of things that happened. And there's a lot of Fae interaction in this, and it leads into what I believe will be the next trilogy and the final trilogy, which will still deal with these characters. But you're mainly following Julian and Emma. Those are like your two main characters. They are parabatai. They've known each other their entire lives. They had to grow up really fast, and that event actually happens in the Mortal Instruments, what makes them have to do that. They are introduced in that series, and they obviously made some mistakes as children because they were children that had to basically act as adults because of situations beyond their control, and now they're kind of dealing with that as well as trying to fight this evil force that they've got themselves entwined with. And this series and the last hours are very connected, even though they take place like 100 years apart. But they deal with like necromancy and stuff, which was a very interesting topic, like, and an interesting take on some things in this universe. It was very different than the Infernal Devices and the Mortal Instruments. So that was my favorite series and my favorite book out of the series because it was the conclusion and the most happened in it. Then I read Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson, and this book was just a good time. It's about a girl named Tress who tries to go outside of her little island that she's never left before to go try to save her friend, and along the way, obviously, like, it's kind of a coming of age story. I'd say it's kind of a coming of age story for her because along the way she's learning about herself and the world and like where her limits are with like how brave she is and like what she's willing to do to save those that she loves and everything. And it was such a fun read. Like, Brandon Sanderson's kind of a funny writer too. Like, he puts humor in his books, which I wasn't expecting, but highly recommend. I was told I probably should have read some other books first, but oh well. I do plan on getting into the Mistborn series, and this was kind of my taste into if I liked his writing style, and this made me very excited to get into Mistborn. So this is part of the Cosmere, so I did get a little bit of that magic system, and it was unique and fun, and I'm so excited to continue in his world. And then you're probably, if you've been here, you know a book's missing, and the book that I've been talking about nonstop all year since I read it, like right after it came out in the spring, and that is Heartless Hunter by Kristen Cicerelli, the first book in the Crimson Moth duology. And I cannot wait for the Rebel Witch. But this is a witch hunter story where you're following Rune and Gideon. Rune is the witch in this situation, and Moonlights is a socialite to try to get information about who the witch hunters are going after so she can try to help her fellow witches. And they know about her. They call her the Crimson Moth, but they don't know who she is. And she ends up like kind of getting into a situationship with Gideon, who is like the best witch hunter in the city. And she knows, obviously, that he's a witch hunter. He has his suspicions about her, but there's an attraction there and there's feelings there that neither one of them can control. And it is very much enemies to lovers. And the ending of this book made me bawl. And I do not know where she's going to go with it now. But I'm very excited to see what the Rebel Witch is about and how that concludes the little duology. But have to wait till February. But definitely, this is my favorite fantasy book of the year. This book and Redeeming Six were my two favorite books of the year. So, highly recommend that. It's YA too, so it's a very easy fantasy to get into. It is very heavy on the romance, but it is also a not spicy book. I think it's more like new adult maybe than YA, but there's still not a lot of spice in it. Okay, so those were the 24 books out of the 200 and I don't even know, 70 some books I think I've read this year. Those are the 24 that I would probably recommend the most. But I did read a lot of really good books this year, so there's probably way more than that. It was really hard to pick just 24 to talk about. So it was a good reading year. And I'm excited to see what 2025 has in store for me. Let me know in the comments below what your favorite book was from 2024 and if you've read any of these. And if you enjoyed them, if you didn't enjoy them, let me know. And I thank you so much for watching and hope to see you all tomorrow for day 21 of Bookmas.